Our first reading today comes from the book of Isaiah, chapter 62, verses 1 through 5. For Zion's sake I will not be silent. For the sake of Jerusalem I will not rest, not until her integrity shines like the dawn, her deliverance like a flaming torch. The nations will see your vindication, and the rulers your splendor. You will have a new name that Yahweh's mouth will bestow. You will be a garland of beauty in Yahweh's hands, a solemn crown worn by your God. Never again will you be called forsaken. Never again will your land be called desolate, but you will be called, my delight is in her, and your land will be called married. For Yahweh will take delight in you, and your land will be joined with God in wedlock. For just as a young couple marry, you will be forever married to this land. As a newly married couple rejoice over each other, so will Yahweh rejoice over you. And from the Gospel of John, chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. On the third day, a wedding took place at Cana in Galilee. Jesus' mother was there, and Jesus and his disciples had also been invited to the wedding. When the wine was gone, Jesus' mother said to him, "They have no more wine." "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied. "My hour has not yet come." His mother said to the servants, "Do whatever he tells you." Nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Jesus said to the servants, "Fill the jars with water." So they filled them to the brim. Then he told them, "Now draw some out and take it to the master of the banquet." They did so, and the master of the banquet tasted the water that had been turned into wine. He did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, "Everyone brings out the choice wine first, and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink. But you have saved the best till now." What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. May God bless the hearing and the living of this word. And further from the writings of Emanuel Swedenborg, True Christianity, number 249. In the individual details in the word, there is a marriage between the Lord and the church, and therefore a marriage between goodness and truth. Because wherever there is a marriage between the Lord and the church, a marriage between goodness and truth is also present, since the latter marriage becomes the former one. When a whole church, or just an individual within a church, has truths, the Lord flows into these truths with goodness and brings them to life. To put another way, when people who are part of a church understand something true, the Lord flows into their intellect and enlivens it by bringing goodwill into it. We all have 2 faculties of life called the intellect and the will. Our intellect is a vessel for truth and therefore wisdom. Our will is a vessel for goodness and therefore goodwill. For us to become part of the universal church, these 2 parts of us have to become one. The 2 parts do in fact become one when we build our intellect with genuine truths and our will is filled with goodness and love. Then the life of truth and the life of goodness are in us. The life of truth in our intellect, the life of goodness in our will. And when these 2 lives are united, they become one life, not 2. And this is the marriage between the Lord and the church, and it is also the marriage between goodness and truth in us. So, my friends, today we find ourselves exploring Jesus' very first miracle in the Gospel of John. Jesus, his mother Mary, and the disciples were at a wedding which had run out of wine to serve. Now, perhaps it is hard for us today to muster any real alarm at the idea of there being no wine left. Weddings in those days were often multi-day affairs, and the implication is that there was at least some wine to begin with. Surely by now, everyone had already had their fill, we might say. Context is certainly helpful for us in understanding why it is that Mary thought that this was worth bringing to Jesus' attention. He was, after all, just a regular guest, not a member of the family or the wedding party. We, in the Western world, for the most part, experience an abundance of fresh and clean water. This is not something we could have assumed of Jesus' day, particularly in a desert climate. Wine was an important drink because fermentation killed various pathogens that might otherwise be present in fresh water. And today we think of wine as an indulgence, but it is possible that in that context there was no alternative to the wine to be drunk. The wedding had been extremely shameful. Cana would not have been that big a place, and the bridegroom would from that point on have been known as the one who ran out of wine at his wedding, and his whole family would have shared in the humiliation. Certainly, that would not have been a good way to start married life for the bride and the bridegroom. Is there anything to which we could compare the situation today? Perhaps we might imagine that a wedding reception or a party only served half the people dinner, or had no working bathrooms for 100 people. Even so, it is hard to replicate for us now the urgency that would have been felt by the original hearers of the story. Jesus saved the wedding party from acute and lasting embarrassment, and the guests from potentially dangerous dehydration. It is a story of abundance and grace urgently needed, but where it was least expected. However, I thank a couple of my former seminary classmates for bringing this to my attention, but water being changed into wine is not good news for all people. Those who are challenged by alcohol addiction will hear this story very differently than those who are not. Likewise, for all the many references to wine in the Gospels, including how it is the foundation of our communion theology. So we've already mentioned why wine was so prevalent a drink in ancient times. Jesus simply used the forms of his day, and our relationship to those forms has changed somewhat in modern times. This is one reason why it is so important to recognize the metaphorical nature of what Jesus was doing. This is not a miracle about wine in and of itself, but about what the wine represents, the potential for transformation. In this story, it is the wine that holds space for this idea, but such divine gifts are written into the fabric of reality and could be seen in so many things. We might think of raw ingredients being made into a cooked meal. We might think of the journey of a caterpillar to a butterfly. We might think of a diamond being converted from a lump of carbon, or the transformation of blossom to fruit. When we interpret this story through a Swedenborgian lens, which takes elements of the story and asks what they represent within ourselves, we can see that in a larger sense, we are exploring how it is that people can grow and change. The water pots represent our normal way of doing things, filled with water that represents our normal way of thinking. We might have inherited these forms of perspectives. We might have accepted them due to their prevalence in the world around us. They might even seem to serve us and society in certain ways. But they are not expressing the fullness of God's intention for us, not expressing the reality of God's love as fully as possible. For in a Swedenborgian worldview, the wine always represents truth that comes from goodness, truth that has gained its soul and its reality from love. Our life and all of its manifestations, both boring and sublime, need to be filled with a rationale that serves love, so that our presence in the world likewise serves love. And this is what is represented by Jesus turning water into wine. And I'm sure that we can think of many examples in our own lives when our old ways of being become transformed into something more loving, when old habits give way to a new awareness. Perhaps we have relinquished control and gifted someone the space they need. Or conversely, perhaps we have relinquished self-centeredness and gifted someone true attention. Perhaps we have stopped going through the motions and have come to understand the gift of the present moment or the power of showing up. Perhaps we have come to recognize our privilege or our responsibility or our belovedness, and we now act differently. These are the goals and gifts of the spiritual life, what we call in our tradition the process of regeneration. However, when these transformations occur, when water is transformed into wine on personal and societal levels, there is often pushback. There are always parts of ourselves and parts of the world that are invested in the status quo and don't want it to change because it serves them as it is. And I'm not saying it is wrong to be skeptical of change in all circumstances. Clearly, not all change is good, and not all progress is positive. Technology, for example, while it has done so much good in the world, has also initiated climate change, increased income inequality and consumerism, and has made war incomprehensibly more deadly, among other things. Which is why it is so important to keep in mind the context of the gospel story for today. It was a wedding, a community event. This miracle of transformation occurred within a community in order to serve that community. It was a miracle that worked to draw people deeper into community with each other, that allowed a host to continue to attend to his guests and provide for their needs. Swedenborg writes that a marriage represents the love that God has for us and that we have for God, a desire for union between God and people. When we evaluate some change we see around us or in us, when we observe a transformation in ourselves or in our world, and we wonder, is this what is meant by the wedding at Cana and the miracle of water into wine? We also should wonder, what is this change looking towards? Greater community or greater separation? And this is where we can learn much from the preaching of Martin Luther King Jr., whose life we will commemorate as a country tomorrow. One of the bedrocks of his philosophy was the beloved community, which was not a utopian vision of something far away, but a practical earthly vision where, in his words, love and trust will triumph over fear and hatred because a critical mass of people are committed to and trained in the philosophy and methods of nonviolence. He writes in a sermon, "In a real sense, all life is interrelated. All people are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. This is the interrelated structure of reality." End quote. Reverend Dr. King understood that God pushes us forward into change, yes, but only for the purpose of greater connection with ourselves, with God, and with others. When speaking of the Montgomery bus boycotts, Martin Luther King said, "The end is reconciliation, the end is redemption, the end is the creation of the beloved community." It is this type of spirit and this type of love that can transform opponents into friends. It is this type of understanding goodwill that will transform the deep gloom of the old age into the exuberant gladness of the new age. It is this love that will bring about miracles in the hearts of men. End quote. The story at the wedding at Cana and the words of Martin Luther King call us to believe in miracles in the hearts of people. Miracles of abundance that, in the words of Caroline Lewis, lead to or restore relationship. And in that community with each other, we find, as the steward in the story said, the best is saved for last. As we allow the transformation of water into wine, as we must do in this life in order to spiritually progress, we will find an abundance and a quality and a grace that could not have been foretold. God's love and providence are always working towards union, always working towards the beloved community. In these years before us, I hope we will continue to have the courage to believe in that. Amen.